Good morning. I want to start by saying thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to be here to speak. I'm not a wildlife biologist, although I have a zoology degree and I aspired to be a wildlife biologist when I finished my zoology degree 25 years ago. And I was hopeful at that point to be working in organizations like the one we're visiting, the organizations represented here today. But I found that it was really difficult to study those animals that kept running away from me. And so I decided instead to focus on the habitat. And so I'm a forest ecologist. I work on wildfire and other disturbances, and I want to share with you some of what I've been learning that I think is highly relevant to try to understand the dynamics of our vegetation today and the habitats then. I want to reflect for a moment on some of the lessons learned because there have been some amazing presentations here at the conference so far. And I wanted to reflect first of all on Dr. Geist's keynote messages because they really resonated with me, although I'm not working specifically in wildlife biology or ecology. The first message he gave us was about worldview and experience and how much it influences how we see the ecosystems around us and how we perceive and understand them to work. He gave us an example of Europeans arriving hundreds of years ago and seeing a landscape that was empty and available for resource use, not acknowledging the First Nations who were there and using those lands. And so I want to pause and also acknowledge today that we're here on the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa and the Sinixt First Nations. We know broadly, we've had many conversations over the last couple of days, that ecosystems are tremendously dynamic and complex. And yet, in our management and our conservation efforts, we simplify them. We simplify landscapes so we can extract timber. We try to suppress all fires and control them. What we've ended up with then are unintended consequences that have tremendous costs to us. Who knew that by adding wolves, we would jeopardize caribou? Who knew that by reducing the fish or the fishing of the Garrity trout, we would drive our kokanee salmon perhaps to local extinction? As I was reflecting on this, it kind of made me think that we've come up with some sort of passive-aggressive management. Aggressive in trying to control everything, passive in the way that we are trying to conserve things. And again, Dr. Geist made the comment that we are under the delusional impression that conservation is drawing a line on the map and then not letting human impacts exceed their current existence within the boundaries of that line, and that the ecosystem and the wildlife will be just fine. Obviously, that hasn't worked for us. So I want to introduce the idea of resilience, which is a real buzzword these days. But with resilience, I want to talk about adaptation, and I want to key in on the idea of allowing ecosystems to function. So we need to understand how they worked in the past. And we've had a good introduction, some background concepts about that today. So let's take a look at what fire might look like on the landscape. This lightning was ignited by lightning, or this is a lightning ignited fire. This is the view from downtown Nelson, just upslope from us. This was July 2015. The fire itself burned for several days and weeks. The community was on evacuation alert. If you go outside, you can look up the lake and you'll actually see up in the mountain where you can see right down to the snow accumulated on the ground because that's where the fire was burning. So what do you see when you look at this fire? Do you see a threat to the town of Nelson? Destruction of the forest? A source of heterogeneity and diversity in our habitats? An evolutionary force to which our species are adapted? Or maybe an essential ecosystem function? And that's where I want to make emphasis about wildfire. So this fire in Nelson kind of sets the stage. I want to point out that these really kind of high impact fires are the ones that grab the media's attention and then shape our understanding of how fire works in our ecosystems. But in fact, those high severity crown fires, the ones that are kind of forest replacing and initiating new forests, they are only one end of a very long spectrum of forest fire types. So these stand replacing or crown fires that have such big impacts, and here you're looking into a forest that's been burned, it's killed all the trees, it's consumed the organics down on the ground to white ash. And yet we have species like lodgepole pine and other tree species adapted to those fires that will regenerate within days or weeks after that fire, taking advantage of the environment, nutrients in the soil, direct sunlight, no competing plants. And if we zoom out and look at the landscape, these fires don't burn everything within them. They're not devastating the landscape. In fact, they're creating heterogeneity. You can see the patches that survived within the gray area that burned. You can see the light green of the trees beginning to regenerate and other vegetation, giving us diversity and structures and legacies that are really important for habitat, for our wildlife. On the other end of the spectrum, we can talk about low severity fires. These are ones that are stand maintaining or forest maintaining. They burn in the understory at low impact. They burn the grasses and forbs above ground, stimulate them though to continue to grow. And in fact, many of our species in our dry forests and grasslands are adapted to fire and require it as part of their life cycle to exist. Here's a sequence of photos taken from Vaso Lake, West Vaso Lake in the Okanagan, where we have the situation before with a lot of fine fuels, dead shrubs, dead grass, not much growing on that site, a prescribed fire, and then following it within weeks, arrowleaf balsam root that came up to my knees. And when I visited it again last spring, it was the most amazing crop of arrowleaf balsam root I've ever seen. When fires burn like this one, and they're close to our homes and communities, of course we need to protect our lives and our homes. And so there's some suppression that is really, really important within our ecosystems, especially when our values are at risk. But I would say we've kind of pushed the boundaries. We've taken that a little bit further to say we also need to protect our livelihoods and the forests from which we gain a lot of our economic basis here in British Columbia. So we have a long legacy in BC of training and having wildland firefighters who are world-renowned in their skills, who are extremely capable, and who serve us well in our society by putting out those fires, especially those close to our towns. But we've become so good at it that in fact over the last 40 years, on average, the BC Wildfire Service has put out 92% of the fires, and only about 6 or 8 in any given year escape suppression. And those are the ones that are still active in our landscape. Those are the ones that burn under hot, dry conditions, under the most extreme fire weather, and they tend to be the big crown fires that are fast-moving and hard to control and have the severe impacts on the landscape. Now, as we put out fires and as we control them, all those of that 92% of fires that we've stopped have meant that the trees have grown into stands, they've become more dense, the landscapes are less diverse, so we've homogenized the landscapes, and as we've seen in the last decade, we've compromised forest health. When we leave the same thing everywhere across broad swaths of land, all of the forest becomes equally susceptible to things like mountain pine beetle. And so fire suppression contributed to that particular event. And I think we've seen abundant evidence here in British Columbia that when you have changed those forests so dramatically, when you increase the fuels within them, and you get a hot, dry year, we have fires that are, again, hot, dry, severe, fast-moving, difficult to control, with impacts both ecologically and to our communities as we see fires burning into the wildland-urban interface. Now, I'm going to argue today that we've altered those fire regimes and that we haven't had equal effect on both ends of that spectrum. The high-severity fires, some of them still burn, as we've seen, but we have very effectively eliminated those lower severity fires. They're the ones that burn under cooler conditions, they're the ones that are easier to control, and they're the ones that we put out very, very effectively. And so I want to think about what happens when you start removing just one end of the spectrum of wildfire. How does that impact our forests and our habitat? When I go out into the forest, any dry forests in BC, I'm often looking for fire scars. So the black triangle you can see at the base of this tree is the charred remains of the interior part of the tree that has been damaged by historical fires and is storing in the tree rings of that, or the rings of that tree, when those fires burned, in what year, and in fact the season. So the disc to the right is a cross-section from a tree in the Caribou, a Douglas fir. Now our Douglas fir and ponderosa pine and larch have thick bark. It insulates the growing tissues from damage from fire. So if the fire is low enough severity and it heats up the tree will survive, but parts of the cambium, the growing tissue, will be killed. So in this particular tree, it established in 1809, and it burned in 1837, and about 40% of the circumference of the tree was killed, but the other 60% still continued to form rings, no longer in concentric circles, but now in arcs, trying to protect that damaged tissue. It burned again in 1858, and yet the tree continued for another century and a half, forming rings, wrapping around those damaged tissues, and recording the history in the forest. Now, by looking under microscopes, we can figure out not only the exact year, but we can figure out the season when those fires burned. We can differentiate spring versus late summer or fall fires. So I'm going to show two examples of where we've done that. And one, I'm going to start in the grassland forest ecotone in amongst our ponderosa pine and Douglas fir forests. And how many of you are here from the Okanagan? Okay, so this is an example close to your home. Vaso Lake, West Vaso Lake, is just outside Okanagan Falls. It is managed by the Canadian Wildlife Service, and they are concerned about endangered habitat, loss of species, and they have an ecological restoration program that they've implemented at the site. One of the questions that they've asked, though, is how frequently should we burn, and what sorts of impact should we be looking for from our fires? So they turn to us to help to give that information back to them. The grid on the left is our study area just east of the lake. So it's bounded by the lake. It's bounded by a cliff that wraps from the north to the west side. And if you look at the very bottom, the southern end of the study area, there is an archaeological site. This was a sylph village that was occupied up until the mid-1800s. Now, we've gone into the forest and sampled at 40 different sites. So in the graph I'm going to show you here, each horizontal line represents one individual site. The length of the line tells you about the age of the oldest trees. And each of those red ticks on the lines are showing you when a fire scar indicated a fire burned trees at that particular plot. So let me fill in the rest of the plot, because this is the history of fire from the mid-1600s to the present. So lots of red ticks. And then a real change in the late 1800s, and then periodic fires through the 1900s. That boundary right there, 1865, that's when smallpox came through. It's when the oral history and the recorded history at that site said that the impact on the First Nation community was so high that the survivors left and moved north to Penticton. Prior to 1865, we recorded 27 different fires. They burned once every 7 years on average, sometimes with just 3 years from fire to fire, sometimes longer intervals of 25 years. And almost a fifth of the fires burned in the spring, in the early season. Post-1865, we've only had 10 fires. The intervals have doubled, although the range of variation is similar. There's some overlap, although the longest interval is now 43 years since fire. And only 4% of the fire scars indicate spring burning. So what did that do to the forest? The graph I'm adding at the bottom is a frequency histogram of how old the trees are. So the trees on the left, the ticks on the left, are showing you how many trees established back in the 1600s through the 1700s. And you'll notice that almost all the trees at this site, 88% of the trees at West Vaso Lake, have established since 1865. A whole bunch of them established in that window, the fire gap, when there was not one fire, very few fire scars occurring. There's a dip in the number of trees that established and survived during the dirty 30s, the drought. And then we see trees continuing to establish onto the forested land right through to the present. So we've changed the fire regime from a frequent, low-impact, patchy fires that resulted in scattered trees and open habitat to one that has infrequent but widespread fires And the trees in those long intervals between fires grow up large enough that they have thick enough bark to protect them from the fires. And so they survive, and the forest is becoming denser and denser. And the habitat quality, if we were looking for open woodland habitat for the red and blue listed species on the site, the habitat is decreasing in quality and value. We have attributed the pre-1865 fire regime primarily to Aboriginal burning. This is a 400-hectare site. We've done some simulation models. It's virtually impossible to get enough lightning strikes to burn this 400 hectares, bounded by a lake, surrounded by cliffs, to get it to burn once every 7 years. Since 1960, there have been 2 lightning strikes at Faso Lake that have been put out by the Wildfire Service. And those kind of longer intervals and widespread fires, well, they all started right on the edge of the lake, right next to the Kettle Valley Railway, which probably threw off some sparks. And every one of those fires in the 20th century, they burned during drought years, when those sparks would have initiated a spreading fire. So our human impacts, the cumulative impacts on this ecosystem from a change in the fire regime completely driven by people over hundreds of years, has big impacts for habitat and wildlife. And these are some of the species whose habitat are being lost. I want to take you as well to Creston, to the Darkwoods, another area that is being protected intentionally here, or the goal here is to protect for caribou and for grizzly bears, amongst other species. The map on the bottom shows our study area at the south end of the Darkwoods. Now, the map is a little odd because the top right corner is the lake at Creston, and as you go to the bottom of the map, it's going uphill. So it's a little counterintuitive, but we're going upslope. Again, what we've done is put in a whole series of plots, and 25 out of 40 of our plots had evidence of fire. Below the red dashed line, the natural disturbance types in our biodiversity guidebook of British Columbia says there should be fire scars and frequent fires. Above the dashed line, the only fires that are supposed to burn are once every 150 years or more to replace the forest, to stand replacing fire. Despite that, look at all the stands and all those ticks that occurred. We have fires burning at low to moderate severity that trees survived, much higher in elevation over very long periods of time. In this landscape, we had 41 fires between 1440 and 1963. The intervals went from just a few years to more than a century at any given point in the landscape, but on average, they were burning kind of once every 20 to 70 years. Take a look at the 20th century. Second half of the 20th century, there's no fire scars. Each one of those plots that has a red star, the fire-free period in the 20th century exceeds the maximum interval that had occurred at that site before fire suppression was implemented. So this is another landscape, even in our mountain landscapes where we don't expect fires, surface fires, we're having an effect. Think about what that might mean for the grizzly bear and for the caribou that live on this land. Now, the black line, squiggly line along the bottom, that's where the Provincial Biodiversity Guidebook says the surface fires are supposed to stop. Now, the map that's draped over the landscape is from all of our plots and all of our fires reconstructed together to figure out where were the hot spots in the landscape. The red spots are places that were burning at a frequency of about once every 25 years. The yellow go up to about a century, and the blue at high elevation and on north-facing slopes, some of them haven't burned in almost 500 years. So our biodiversity guidebook, it tells us how much old growth to maintain. It tells us how much logging we should do. It tells us whether or not we should be suppressing fires, because it gives us our interpretation of the type of fire on the landscape. Those are the numbers that were supposed to occur, completely not supported by our data. And so the epic fail needs to be corrected. And I would say we need to push that limit of where surface fires and mixed severity fires occur to much higher elevations, which means completely changing how much even age management and clear cuts we should use, how much we should be protecting for old growth, and what those forests should look like and how they function. And I think when we start changing those landscapes in these ways, the consequences for the wildlife habitat are dire. Now, I've had some people tell me they're not quite convinced by our CSI investigations of fire scars and tree ages, so I want to show you two other lines of evidence that we've put in our toolbox to try to understand how fires work. So here I'm taking you to the Rocky Mountain Trench, to the Cranbrook Fire Zone. And we've been working with the Wildfire Service. We have access to, they provided us all their lightning strike data. And these are lightning ignited fires that an IA crew, an initial attack crew, went out and put out the fire and then recorded its location and some information about it. Over a 22-year period in the 90s through to 2012, there were 942 lightning ignitions. If we just focus on the valley bottom dry forests, those are in the gray at the bottom, the Douglas fir and ponderosa pine systems in the bottom of the valley, there was almost 200 lightning strikes that started fires. In total, those 191 fires burned 194 hectares. 97% of those fires were less than 4 hectares in size, which is exactly what the Wildfire Service was doing, mandated by fire suppression. Incredibly successful. 3% of the fires exceeded 4 hectares, and the biggest one was 52 hectares. Now, we did some modeling. The Canadian Fire Behavior Prediction System lets you look at what type of forest or fuel you're in. You can look at the fire weather, and we looked it up for the days these lightning ignitions occurred, and we did some modeling. And if we had let those fires go, we think we could have burned 25,000 hectares of forests in the Rocky Mountain Trench in low elevation dry forests, grasslands, woodlands, dry forests, in just a 22-year period. What happens when we put out these fires? So here we're still in the trench, we're just outside Kimberley. Under a surface fire regime, we get a lot of grasses. That's the light gray in the picture. The dark gray in the picture are where we have woodlands and trees and forests. The picture here is from 1951. Let's start excluding fire by changing land use. Let's start suppressing fire very effectively after the Second World War. And this is what the landscape looked like in 2004, almost completely forested. So we had a fuels buildup. Do you think we've changed the resilience of those forests? Do you think they can resist surface fire? This is more likely to be a crown fire, and let me show you why. When we change forest structures from being an open forest on the left to a mature closed canopy forest in the middle, to a much younger kind of post-fire or post-logging forest where you have many, many small trees that are highly dense, we changed the fuel structures. The graphs at the bottom are reflecting the type of fire that would burn in those ecosystems over the average fire weather in the Rocky Mountain Trench. As you can see in the open grassland forest, open woodland forest, most of the fires throughout the fire season were burned as a surface fire. Under the exact same weather regime, same weather data, but in a closed canopy forest, we get more fires that are described as intermittent. They kind of crown or torch, and some of them can be crown fire spread from tree to tree. If you go to those doghair thickets, those really dense young stands, any of our regenerating stands that are quite young, or those that have stagnated in absence of fire over the last century, look at the potential for crown fire. Much more likely to burn in a high severity fire. They're a fuel hazard. Poor wildlife habitat. When they're close to our communities, they put us at risk. So this is the exact same weather played out in different types of forests. So we increase fire severity. What if we add in climate change? We've all seen the signs that tell us what the fire danger rating is every day. Well, we've taken some data and we've calculated, for the 1990s to 2012, what was the distribution of these fire weather conditions. This is an example from the Caribou. When we project forward based on climate change, look at the number of days that are extreme or very high or extreme. They've increased 3- or 4-fold. That means years like 2003 that we thought were extreme, that's going to be average when my grandchildren are standing in this room giving you a presentation. Well, presenting to your grandchildren. Okay, so we've got changes in terms of landscape, things that we have done to the landscape that change our fuels. We add in climate change, we end up with more frequent and severe fires. We call this the fire suppression paradox. Here's one of those unintended consequences. By trying to protect forests from fire, thinking all fire was bad, we have created conditions where now our forests are at much higher risk of being damaged due to fires and the types of fires that would burn just in an average fire season today. So here's where the action needs to be taken place. We need to be applying active management to try to increase our forest ecosystem function and resilience. And I'm going to give you two panels here because we can't do the same thing everywhere. If you're in a dry forest with these open conditions versus closed canopy forest at high elevation or in the subboreal or boreal, you have very different conditions, so you have to make management choices that will vary with those forest and fire types. So the surface fires versus the crown fires. In both cases, we have fuels building up, one because of fire suppression, the other because of interactions with climate and insects, creating changes to the landscape and fuels, suppression of the fire, making our landscapes very homogeneous. If we add the climate change that makes them more combustible, what we're seeing are those more frequent and severe fires. So we need to adapt. And I would say we need to adapt not only our wildfire management, but we need to adapt the way that we're managing the fuels, which is really timber industry. Our goal is to try to increase resilience to climate change. We're not going to be able to stop climate change, but we can alter the structures on the landscape. We can change the configuration of the forests so that we make them more resilient, so that we alter the habitats, and hopefully we can do that in a way that is win-win. So I'm going to leave three different models or three different avenues that we can be using to try to increase resilience. So one, it's rare that people stand up at a podium like this and then give kudos to the government, but I'm going to. The 2012 to 2017 wildfire the strategic plan from the Wildfire Management Branch, they changed the mandate from 100% suppression to allowing fires to burn in the landscape when it's safe to do so. And that goal was to encourage healthy and sustainable and resilient ecosystems. And so since 2012, we've seen an increase in the area burned in British Columbia by choice. We let some of those fires go to get fire back on the landscape, to add diversity. And we're careful, we let those happen only in places where they don't put lives and values at risk. But we don't protect all of our timber values any longer. We have active use of fire to restore ecosystems, and where fire is not appropriate because it puts other values at risk, we can use thinning or mechanical treatments. And so we have numerous agencies within the province that are using these types of methods. So thinning and prescribed fire are being used in many places, not just protected areas, but often in our wildland-urban interface and in the landscape as a whole. I think what's really important, though, is we need to be monitoring to determine if these are effective, and we have to make sure that there's no unintended consequences from them that are going to give us surprises that we hadn't envisioned. And I'd say this is absent from some of these treatments now, and it's really an oversight that should be addressed. I had an interesting conversation with some of the guide outfitters last evening, and I think we all came to the agreement that the way we're managing our forests have negative consequences for habitat. It has negative consequences for wildlife as well. And so I think the forest industry and the way that we are managing our forests also have a really important role to play here. I teach in the Faculty of Forestry, so I'm going to take some ownership here that we are trying to generate in the next generation a different view of how our forests function and how we should be managing them. And that's going to mean at landscapes, we can't be creating these fragmented landscapes that look like a checkerboard. Within stands, we need to leave more legacy trees, the structural diversity that's critical for habitat within an altered patch of forest. And we need to stop planting lodgepole pine everywhere. We need a diversity of species. Again, our legacy in British Columbia is that there will be a new generation of lodgepole pine dominated forests about the time that climate reaches its pinnacle to give us more fires and potentially the next mountain pine beetle outbreak. So let me leave you with these last thoughts. Wildfire plays a critically important function in our ecosystems. It contributes to wildlife habitat in many, many different ways. Fires vary amongst forest types and in different climate units of the province, and so we can't use the same treatments everywhere because fires are different in one forest compared to the other. We can summarize or we can group the way those fires are functioning in different parts of the forest or at different parts of the province so that we can learn from one another, however. When we come up with strategies that we think are effective, we're going to have to consider the cumulative effects and the compounding influences of human actions on our landscapes. We need to work across scales and involve multiple agencies. So the collaboration, that's the theme of this conference, is incredibly important in this context. And I'm going to advocate as well that we need to accept wildfire as an important part of the solution. We need to let some fires burn. We need to add fire back into the landscape in many places. And where it's unsafe to do that, we need a surrogate. We need to use what we know about changing forest structures to reduce our risk of high severity fire, but still provide that critical habitat that we know our wildlife needs. And with that, I'd be glad to take questions.